There you go.
Are
You're
we recording?
recording.
Okay.
You're recording.
All right. So Ernie Kimmel, I will turn this over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Jenny. It's just a warning to all of you that no good deed goes unpunished. You make a good suggestion and you wind up needing to do it. But anyway, this that we call this time of during the week the journey class is very appropriate because each of us is on a spiritual journey. And I appreciate this opportunity to share some of the highs and lows of my journey thus far. If I named everyone who had influenced me over 80 plus years, we'd be here all afternoon, so I won't do that. But John's sermon this morning was really he could have read my introductory remarks in his pointing out that Jesus came to the disciples and to calm their doubts and fears, that it was Jesus taking the action. And he ended his charge to us as at the end of the service with, "May Jesus find you and bring you his peace." And I thought that was just right where I wanted to start. And with first verse of an old hymn written back in 1878 that I think captures perhaps the most important thing I have learned on my spiritual journey. And I'll just read the first verse. I sought the Lord, and afterward I knew he moved my soul to seek him, seeking me. It was not I that found, O Savior, true. No, I was found of thee. Throughout our life, God is reaching out in love to us, desiring to call each of us my child. In our human strength, we cannot find God. All we can do is respond to God's invitation to be a child of God and to partake in God's creative love for all creation. The second general point I make at the outset is that God's invitation and nudging usually comes through the form of another person. And I think all of us can probably name people in our lives who have helped us on our spiritual journey. So how did I get to this point? In many respects, my spiritual journey begins with my maternal grandfather, a poorly educated man who worked on railroads and in sawmills in northern Wisconsin during the early decades of the 20th century. However, in whatever little village the family lived, he would organize a Sunday school for his and all the other children. He was a great influence on my mother's faith, and she in turn on mine. I was baptized at the West Side Presbyterian Church in Beloit, Wisconsin, southern Wisconsin, where my dad was an elder and both my parents had led a youth group before I was born. In my preschool days, my mother read Bible stories to me regularly and frequently. As I learned to read, most of the books bought for me were Christian books chosen to protect me from the evils that might lurk in secular books. My reading was supplemented by listening to WMBI, the radio station of the Moody Bible Institute. When I was about 5, my mother got in a snit with our Presbyterian pastor, and we moved to a newly formed, non-denominational, and in retrospect, quite fundamentalist congregation. As a kid and teen, I was active in that congregation, and developed a belief that being a Christian was about what you did not do. Did not smoke, drink, dance, go to movies, curse, play cards, etc., etc. The entire focus was on one's personal salvation and proving that by living a righteous life. Although as an adult, I've rejected much of the theology and ethos of my childhood upbringing, I do highly value the thorough knowledge of the Bible that I learned as a child in that context. Near the end of high school, it was assumed that I would go to college, but definitely to a Christian college like Wheaton. In God's mysterious way, however, a school counselor encouraged me to apply to more challenging colleges. And I not only was admitted to Harvard, but received a full scholarship. As you might imagine, Harvard was a rude shock on almost every dimension. On the faith front, I was helped by having a roommate who was also a professing Christian from an even stricter sect than mine. He was raised a Plymouth Brethren. His older brother was a junior, and through him, both my roommate and I became involved in the Harvard Christian Fellowship, an affiliate of the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship organization. The Harvard Christian Fellowship provided a framework for times of prayer, Bible study, fellowship, and thinking about one's faith. For the first time, I encountered Christians who actually thought and debated their faith, did not just accept certain dogmas as given directly by God for all time. It was there that I first experienced studying the Bible inductively, that is, reading the text and seeing what it said to me, rather than being given a particular interpretation. During my first year, although I visited several congregations, I really did not find a church home. However, I eventually joined some of the other Harvard students in riding the subway into Boston to attend Park Street Church, a historic congregational church on the Boston Common. At that time, its pastor was Harold John Ockengay, who was a major leader in the evangelical strand of the church. I heard some powerful preaching and participated in their extensive program for college students. All in all, I was starting to develop a broader understanding of the nature of Christ's church. I continued to be active in the Christian Fellowship, and in the spring of my sophomore year was elected president of the group. That spring, the Harvard Christian Fellowship and its companion group at Radcliffe College sponsored a so-called mission to Harvard and brought John Stott from England. Stott was a rising leader in the evangelical wing of the Anglican Church, a pastor in central London, a prolific writer, and with a gift for communicating the gospel to students and academics. And his writings still influence my thinking to this day. But then came the summer of 1957. Another one of God's little quirks, I think. I had the opportunity to spend 8 or 9 weeks in the Middle East that summer. This unsophisticated boy from the Midwest really had his eyes open. In London, there were still shells of buildings destroyed in World War II. In Belgrade, they were even further behind in rebuilding after the war. The train from Salonika to Istanbul was full of ethnic Turks who were being repatriated in a kind of ethnic cleansing that the Yugoslavs, the Greeks, and the Turks were going through in the 1950s. Seeing little Turkish kids whose heads were green with fungus was unbelievable. As for many other experiences that summer, I remember attending Sabbath services in an ancient synagogue in Cairo, where the Jewish community was living in fear of its life. I remember visiting Palestinian refugee camps in the desert near Jericho, emphasizing how inhuman human beings are to each other. I had the experience of being arrested on the Mount of Olives, which gave me a firsthand sense of the kind of fear and violence that defines life for so many people. The culmination of that summer's experiences totally upset my faith. How could there be a loving God with so much hatred, fear, and violence in the world? Nothing I had been taught seemed believable. I returned from my junior year of college and resigned from the leadership of the Christian Fellowship. I entered into a prolonged period in the wilderness where Sartre, Camus, and other existentialists seemed more appealing than the Christian faith. Thank God that there were a number of more mature Christians who walked with me during this period. With their help, I gradually began to regain faith in God, knowing that most of the aspects of religion with which I had been brought up needed to be re-examined and either discarded or integrated into a different way of understanding God and the world, a process that continues to this day. During these years, I had met and began dating Gabrielle. Although she was raised as an Episcopalian, she only found that for which she was seeking when some of the Christian women at Radcliffe led her to a personal relationship with Christ. In 1960, we were married and together began attending the First United Presbyterian Church in Cambridge. It was in that congregation that I first served on a pastor nominating committee, and where 59 years ago, this past February, I was ordained as an elder. Another unexpected jog in the path. A few months later, we went to Nigeria to be part of a team developing a model comprehensive high school with the Nigerians shortly after their independence. Again, God provided a number of key experiences during those years. During the first few months, we lived in Ibadan, at that time the largest Black city in the world, and attended the University Chapel on Sundays. This was our first significant experience of worshiping with people of other cultures and races, drawn from many different denominations. Wow, Christ Church really was more varied than I ever possibly conceived. The time in Nigeria also helped me understand that our faith could not just be imposed on another culture. Every people have to respond to God's call in their way, not in a way that worked for someone else. Watching the imperialistic approach to mission left a lasting impression on me. The third experience from Nigeria that I want to mention was learning to nourish our faith without a community or a pastor. The only churches in the village, about 50,000 people, where we lived, worshiped in Yoruba, a language we did not learn. Gabrielle and I discovered that we needed to set time aside every Sunday for our own spiritual life, praying and reading published sermons to each other. During this time, we became acquainted with the work of Helmut Thielicke, a German pastor and theologian, whose sermons we still remember to this day, especially one entitled The Waiting Father, that emphasized God is the person acting and reaching out to the prodigal and to us. Upon returning to the States with a 10-month-old son, we became members of the Presbyterian Church of Springfield over in Delaware County, and our son was baptized there. A couple of years later, we moved to Cherry Hill and became active in Trinity Presbyterian Church. We were both involved in a small group program where we met monthly for study and fellowship. I was involved in a church-sponsored tutoring program in Camden, and Gabrielle was ordained as an elder at Trinity. We began to see how a healthy church could function, and that the good news applied to the society around us, not just to our personal salvation. In 1968, we moved to central New Jersey and became involved in the life of Pennington Presbyterian Church, a congregation that was founded in 1709. We were active leaders in that congregation until we moved down here to Kendall in 2012. Those years were not always smooth, either for the congregation or for my personal life. There were times when my faith was seriously challenged, and there were times when it was strengthened. Two of the most challenging times were health related. When I was diagnosed with prostate cancer in 1996, and later when I needed heart surgery in 2011. In those situations, one's first instinct is to say, "Oh God, why me?" Yet through the support of God's people, I have learned that God does work good, even from seemingly bad things. There were also many times of blessing. One particular incident that comes to mind is when I was working at Educational Testing Service. I was promoted to be head of test development for all the college board programs, the SAT, PSAT, advanced placement exams, and so on. A dear member of that congregation in Pennington took me out to lunch and pointed out the tremendous ethical responsibility I had assumed with this promotion. To be sure that these tests, which affect tens of thousands of young people each year, were the best that it was possible to make. During the years, many years, we've had the opportunity to worship God with sisters and brothers in many countries: Mexico, Guatemala, Colombia, Bolivia, Brazil, Nigeria, Ghana, Egypt, England, Scotland, Germany, Hungary, all of which helped me to understand that God does indeed love the world. Our pastors in Pennington encouraged us to become involved in the work of Presbytery of New Brunswick. I served many years on the committee of ministry, working with pastors and congregations in times of conflict during pastoral transitions. Again, God was teaching me how diverse and multifaceted Christ Church is. Upon my retirement from ETS, the Presbytery elected me as stated clerk, an office that I fulfilled for the next 10 years. The last 3 of which I also served as acting head of staff for the Presbytery. One of the most important practices was for the Presbytery staff to gather weekly for a time of Bible study and prayer, helping each of us to grow in faith and in discerning where God was at work among the 40+ congregations of the Presbytery. Through that avenue, I also became involved with the activities of the General Assembly. I served 2 terms on the Presbytery's Cooperative Committee on Examinations, the body responsible for creating and administering the ordination examinations required of all would-be Presbyterian ministers. That enabled me to use my knowledge, both of educational measurement and my experience in the church. As state clerk, I was also asked to serve as staff to one or another committee at each of the annual meetings of the General Assembly. At the 2000 General Assembly in Long Beach, California, I was paired with this young pastor who was just in the process of moving from Annapolis to Westchester, Pennsylvania, Don Lincoln. Our job was providing support for one of the committees, but our paths continued to cross in various Presbyterian settings. So when we moved to Kennett Square in 2012, we became part of Westminster without a second thought. Westminster has been a blessing. Of critical importance is that the pastors and leaders recognize that doubt is part of one's faith journey. As I have aged, I've become much more at ease and acknowledge that some things are just a mystery. We humans always want to put God in a box and declare we know God's will or what God is doing in the world. Yet God is so much bigger than we can imagine. In recent years, I continue to wrestle with the question of how God has reached out to people in other parts of the world, not just to the Mediterranean-centered perspective that's embodied in the Christian church. This past year, like many of you, I've wrestled with the issues of how God's people in America support the racism that has been part of our last 4 centuries in our history, and especially the role of the church in oppressing our brothers and sisters of color. The longer I live, the more I think that the ancient prophet Micah, almost 3,000 years ago, had it right when he wrote, "He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God." Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That was
Thank you,
rich.
Ernie.
So I'll give us about 5 minutes to follow up with Ernie to ask some questions, but then I want to make sure we leave plenty of time for Patti as
That is
well. Are there any questions of Ernie? I have to go to the second page because I see there's a second. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any questions. Well, that was-
Jane,
no, go ahead.
Yeah, Ernie, I just had a question. Are there any particular writers, theologians, that influence you today?
good question. Very good question. Brian McLaren's recent book, Faith After Doubt, I found very helpful. I thought he helped me understand my journey in a very constructive way. So of recent readings, that would be one I would point out. I have come to appreciate Richard Rohr and his daily meditation, which keeps pushing us towards an enormous conception of God.
Yeah.
And I think we need that. We get so focused on our own little troubles. And we have a God, a power of love that covers the universe. And I think Roar is a very helpful guide on the way. So those would be two suggestions I'd have.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see Nick's hand.
Ernie, you and I share one experience in common, which is that you mentioned that you came from sort of the Midwest and you got into Harvard on full scholarship, and you glossed it over a little bit. And I know my similar experience was, I went to places like the Riverdale Country School and Yale University, Williams College on full scholarships. And one, there was always a question in my mind if I really belonged.
Absolutely.
Second question was, your values and your culture that you came from were constantly being challenged. And I often described it as being between two worlds, one dead and the other one powerless to be born. Because if you're going from blue collar and you're being exposed to these upper class millionaires and billionaires, you got to kind of find yourself where you are in that spectrum. And I know it affected my religious development tremendously, because I really hung on to my Christian values through that onslaught of attacks. So I was just wondering, did you feel that as well? And did you find your Christianity at that point a help or a hindrance?
I clearly experienced that, and I would say, to this day at times I still wonder, who am I kidding? Why am I here? Because those childhood experiences and the ethos of a blue collar family stay with you. I think the Christian community has what's helped me to get through life. I mentioned some of the people who, after the crushing experience in the Middle East in '57, just calmly walked with me and kept lovingly helping me rethink what I was doing. But I could repeat similar things, I think, in many different times in my life when God has used one or many friends to reach out to me and say, hey, I'm still looking for you, buddy. Where are you? Without that, I have no idea where I would be today. I could be a very cynical old man. So I think community, and in a sense, that's, I think, the takeaway for each of us. We never know how a word of kindness or encouragement to someone is going to help them. And in a sense, speak for God is a symbol of love and caring to them. I think that's a very important thing that each of us can do.
Amen. Amen. Wow. Thank you. I know there's probably more questions to ask, and I hate cutting it off so short, but I do want to be honoring the time for Patti to have it too.
It's okay. If people have more questions of Ernie, go right ahead.
I don't want it to get too long, but we can also, at the very end, those who want to stay on and continue conversation. So I just want to be honoring the time that we've set aside. So we'll turn it over to Patti, and the same thing, if you find that helpful to go to the speaker view, then you're not getting as distracted by the multiple boxes, and then we can come back to the gallery view and mute ourselves so that we're not interfering with background noise. So I'll turn that over to Patti.
Thanks, Jenny. Thank you. Thank you. I have to say, one of the things, every time I hear these kinds of things, one of the things that is so fascinating to me is just how different God's work is in different people's lives. It's just always fascinating to me. So mine, this could be a little disjointed, mostly because God's been disjointed in my life. I always talk about God in my life. It's the theory of the 2x4, which is to say, if anybody's ever built with a 2x4, it hurts if you get hit by one. And that's what God does all the time with me, because apparently I don't listen. And so I end up getting smacked by a 2x4, and it's been from the very beginning. I was born in the early 60s. My sister was 10 years older than I was. And my sister, which meant my sister grew up as, as a 60s, 70s child, but I was therefore a child of the 60s. As odd as that seems, my sister was very involved. She looked like Joan Baez. She acted like Joni Mitchell. She had a bunch of friends like that. And even though I was young, I was allowed to sort of sit at their knees. And so I was sort of inundated with a 60s kind of thing as a very young child. And that really affected me. I was super aware of what was going on in the world when I absolutely shouldn't have been. And her name is Kathy. And so Kath went off to school and became a Campus Crusades for Christ person, and was very into the born again Christian scene, and came home from college on occasion, and she would give her testimonies, etc. And we were church going people. I'm from Pittsburgh, so Midwestern really. And I would listen to her. And one night I asked her if that kind of conversion experience would work for me. And she told me it didn't all work like that, but sure. And it was that classic, say these words and you'll be saved. And I was 11 years old and dropped to my knees and said those words. I confess I'm a sinner. I believe Jesus Christ is my savior. And as I did that, there was a veil. We would call it a veil now. Richard Rohr would call it a veil. Cynthia Bourgeois would call it a veil. There was a screen that I did not know was there, and that lifted in front of my eyes. It was a very clear experience. And I was aware of a universe in front of me that just went on and on and on. And I was aware that I was part of it. And I was aware that it was God, and I was aware that it was eternal, and I knew. And so prefacing anything that has happened to me since then, anytime I question my faith, which is often, I have to go back and go, yeah, well, but, and it would be just blatantly ridiculous of me to not have a faith in light of that. I spent my youth very involved in the church. I was part of, the youth group. We did the youth Sunday stuff. And I preached on Youth Sunday, and my youth minister walked over to me when it was all said and done and said, this is your calling, right? And again, remember, early 70s, there were no women, there were no role models. This was an interesting concept, but what did that even mean? So I had no idea, and did not pursue it. I stayed very involved in the church, and I went off to Duke, which is, by the way, we call that the Harvard of the South. We all did. And I know you guys don't like that, but there you go. And I did nothing with religion. I was a triple major because there was no such thing as a minor. I was a triple major in all those, things you were supposed to do: English, political science, psychology, all of that stuff, which in the end actually played a role in my faith. And I went to a Baptist church off campus, but really spent very little time in my faith at Duke. I don't know why. I had a professor who was a very fundamental Christian who tells me I was the only one who ever wrote anything in papers about God. So clearly God was still at work. I'm friends with him now, and he will tell me, he continues to tell me, you're the only one who ever said or did anything about God. And graduated, came home, and oddly enough, found my husband, who had grown up here in Philadelphia, Bryn Mawr Pres, and we found his youth minister, who was a minister in a nearby church in Pittsburgh. And we started going there, got married, and went off to, again, completely ignoring anything that might be happening with God in my life, went off to New York, lived in Princeton for a million years, and started to have kids. And we were looking at all kinds of churches in Princeton: Lawrenceville, Nassau, Pennington, all those, and just could not find a home. But when the kids were born, it seemed to be important. And somewhere along the line, I was getting very involved in volunteering. And at the same time, again, living next door to Princeton Seminary, I started thinking about it again. And my son was 3 years old. And I was thinking and thinking, do I do these major volunteer projects or do I go to seminary and answer some call that I didn't understand? And my son, who remembers utterly everything about his life, he's just one of those people, you can ask him what happened when he was wherever and he will remember. I was brushing his hair one morning. He was 3 years old. He turned to me. This is the single thing in his life he doesn't remember. He turned to me and in an adult male voice said to me, "Pay attention to me." And I knew exactly what it was. And so my reaction was, no, 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 no. And I didn't. But I knew that it was God continuing to try and get me with these 2x4s. My father died, and I went back to my home church to preach his eulogy. And so I stood in my home church at the same pulpit where I had preached 30 years before, And my youth minister, who was not there, but we had called because he was a family friend, he was presiding over the service. I looked over as I was giving my father's eulogy, and there was this bizarre look on the man's face. And I knew what it was. He didn't. And then it must have dawned on him, because when it was over, he walked over to me and he said, "You know, this is still what you're supposed to do, right?" And I said, but so point being is, God has continued to be extremely clear with me. So we went back to Philadelphia, had never found a church in Princeton, went back to Philadelphia and immediately went to Wayne Pres and got extremely involved. I became an ordained elder. My husband was chair of the mission committee. The kids were totally involved. I had postpartum depression with my fourth child and ended up finding yoga. I think most of you know that I'm a certified trauma sensitive yoga teacher. And I will tell you that yoga saved my life. God reappeared in yoga. This is not woo-woo yoga. I'm not, it's not that. I just knew that there was a communication between me and God in the body work that I was doing. The whole time this was going on, my sister had changed entirely. My sister had given up her Presbyterian faith because she had had a very bad marriage, and our saved youth minister told her that she needed to stay in it because God wouldn't approve of her divorce, and she at that point decided that that was no God of hers. And she developed this sense of God as love, as we probably all know and talk about now. So she had this very expansive view of God as love. She also, though, had decided that God was not omnipotent, not omniscient, because she couldn't deal with suffering. She couldn't deal with things like the Holocaust. She couldn't deal with things that she had lived through in the 60s and the 70s and 80s any longer. And she and I differed on that. I had come to the conclusion that just because we couldn't understand it didn't mean that we then got to impose our own views of God on God just because we didn't get it. So she and I differed on that. But she had this major expansive view of God, which I understood. While we were at Wayne, as I was an ordained elder, we had a major church crisis. Our senior pastor was accused of sexually harassing an associate pastor. The presbytery, I hate to say, swooped in, circled the wagons around him, drummed her ultimately over the course of several years to several states away. It's destroyed her life, basically. So we left the church. It did not destroy our faith. It destroyed our belief in the institution. And that's how we ended up at Westminster, where we have sat for 8 years, kind of recovering. We brought the kids knew what was going on. And so we have recovered at Westminster. It was very difficult. In the meantime, I had found a spiritual director. And my spiritual director was a woman who was at seminary when I would have gone to seminary around Jenny's time. She has since left the church to do spiritual direction and has a what we would call contemplative view of God, which is what I have come to see as God in my life. With her, I have had one experience where the same concept, the veil, which had never come back down, was again revealed to be gone. I was aware that it was like a Thomas Merton experience in Kentucky when he realized his unity with the whole world. I was struck dumb for 4 hours, literally couldn't speak. I could not write. My husband called me somewhere in those 4 hours. I couldn't. There was nothing coming out of me, and I knew what that was. And I really believe that God has done this all along when things are getting hairy, when things are becoming uncertain, when I'm starting to question things. I really believe that this is when the 2x4 comes out for me. We had a mission trip to Israel, which, much like Ernie, will change your life. There's no way to be in the center of where we believe this all began and not feel it. It's one of those thin places. That has kept me going. I spent years at a place called Kairos School of Spiritual Formation, which is out at the Jesuit Center in Warnersville. 3-day weekend retreats for 3 years, where I've become very immersed in the contemplative life. I am a person who follow Thomas Keating, Thomas Merton. God has become an experience for me. Clearly I'm in seminary. Clearly I have the intellectual work going around God. And I believe in all that, but it doesn't spark God in me, if you will. I do a lot of centering prayer. I do a lot of lectio. I do a lot of those experiential things. Somewhere around in the middle of this, I got a phone call from God, again, wondering what I was going to do. Was I being called to seminary? Literally, I am not making this up. The phone rang in one of these days and I just couldn't decide what to do. And I picked it up, and it was a recording of a church in Virginia telling me that if I really wanted to follow God, I should get off my tail end and go do something. And I thought, okay, that's enough. I literally said, that's enough. And I slammed the phone down. I was like, I don't need phone calls from God. I just don't, that's too much for me. Along the way, so obviously I have eventually gotten to seminary. I walked on the campus and it felt like home to me. When I walk into a church building, that feels like home to me. The institution still no longer does. I have 4 children. Along the way, one of my daughters has been raped. My son was attacked in a foreign country and left for dead, and we got him back. These things have shaken our world, but have not shaken our faith. Those 2 children have not in any way turned their back on their faith, but they have a very different faith as well. Again, it's not in the institution anymore. I worry about them both a lot, but even there, I believe this is why God has used the 2x4 with me, because I think without those experiences, I think it would be easy enough for my husband and me to say, this isn't working for us. This can't be. So that brings us up to date. I am a contemplative. I practice all of these other spiritual practices. I teach yoga. I'm a labyrinth facilitator. I find God in the experience. I find God in books. I read a lot of them, but they tend to be books like those written by Thomas Merton or Thomas Keating or Cynthia Bourgeois or, Simone Weil or those sorts of people, Elliot Hellisman, those folks. I take theology classes. I do those, but I don't find God there. I find God in the relationships. Richard Rohr talks about God being in the relationship between the Trinity, the spaces between. I find God there. And I do think that this is, when I look at the path, it's interesting when I look at what's going on now, and I realize I started out way too early aware of these social justice issues and what needed to be done in the world. We're right back there. And I suspect that's where God's pushing me. So it's coming full circle. I have to say it's coming full circle. I'm a little leery of the next 2x4. It makes me a little nervous, but so that's where I am. And as you all know, I'm in seminary, which is a place where you discern whether you're going to be in the institutional church, whether you're going to do it in another way. I'm still listening. I'm still trying to hear. So yeah, so that's where I am. That's my story. That's my 2x4 story. Yeah, that's it. That's what I need to say.
Thank you, Patti. Beautiful sharing just the intimacy,
Mm.
of what God's done with 2x4s, and the events and experiences and questions that you're wrestling with. I want to open it up for follow-up questions or conversation. I see Tom Brenton's hand.
Hi, Patti.
It's okay.
Are you afraid of where God would lead you?
No. No, I think that's something that people wrestle with because no, I've gotten to where I'm not. I don't know that I was ever afraid. I think, in the beginning, Tom, there were no role models, right? So I don't know that I was afraid so much as I didn't know what could that possibly be? Who were women in the church, Now, I don't think I'm afraid. I think it makes me a little leery because I have a feeling it's not going to be easy. I have a feeling it's going to be fraught with something. No, I'm not afraid. I've kind of given up that sort of thing. There's no point in it. No, I'm going there anyway. I did this long enough, I think, I'm expecting it to be a little tricky. I'm expecting it to be a little hard. I know there are things that I have to give up. And by that, I don't mean, I don't actually mean like houses and stuff. I mean like some relationships, that kind of thing. But that's part of it. I trust that God's in that, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
That's helpful.
I see Jane's hand up.
Patti, you talked at the end there a little bit about, well, you talked a lot about your draw to the contemplative way, and how is that at odds, or what is your concern about being part of the institutional church versus and can't those things be brought together?
I do think they can be brought together. Absolutely. I don't know why they can't be. Jane, I was brought up in that we were, it was United Presbyterian Church, right? And that was in the days where the way was the way. And everybody else was going to just, end up in hell. So that's what I spent years sloughing off because it never felt right to me. I just couldn't believe that, my best friends who were Catholics were getting, I just couldn't believe that. And so I never felt okay with that. I do think that it can be done. I think that some of what I'm seeing now, there are those who believe that the institutional church as it is, based on creeds and that sort of stuff and just the ritual and all that, is the way. And I don't think that's going to work. I don't think that's going to be it. But I think that what we're really called to and what the Christian church is really supposed to be actually is part of that, right? It actually is doable. It's frankly one and the same thing. Christ was a contemplative. There's kind of a joke with Richard Rohr and those guys. Jesus was a contemplative. Jesus was a yogi. But we're not allowed to say those things. So yes, I do think it can. But I just think some of what. Sorry. Who just said that? Did I just say something? Go ahead. I said yogi. Yes, I said Jesus was a yogi. But by that, I just meant he was. I believe Jesus was. He was experientially connected to God. He was God, right? So yeah, no, I think the church as it was meant to be absolutely is completely doable. Those two things are not at all separate. I just think that there's portions of it that's a little caught up in the box piece of it, right? The sort of these are the only things that we can, and that's the part that I think is not going to work. If we look at why folks are leaving, young people aren't coming. I think they don't understand that box anymore, you know, and I think that we just have to think about ways to change that box and present that picture. You're not going to scare a child into coming into church anymore by telling them they're dying. They're going to go to hell if they don't believe what we believe. That's a surefire way to keep them out, right? So yeah, but no, I think it's one and the same. Yeah. Just the institutional church that I grew up with, I don't think is going to do it.
I see Nick's hand.
Penny, I got to go to Credo. Could I step in real quick?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Patty, totally agree with you. Everything you said. I believe it's a relational deal. Okay. The whole idea is God, you know, sending us a being that we could understand him through that. That's the relationship. And I just I hope that you've read some Buber. Okay. Cause I really love Buber and have, you know, pretty much staked my life out on that. You know,
The I thou is the coolest thing. Yeah.
absolutely, the I now. And so anyway, I gotta go. Thanks, Nick. I'll see you. I gotta go to Credo. Bye.
Bye, Betsy.
All right, Nick.
So, Patricia, very interesting talk. And I wanted to follow up on Jane's point, because Jane, I think, really asked you a really crucial question for your development. Is there a way for you to put together your contemplative spiritual nature with an institutional church? And I think if you really look around with open eyes today, whether you're talking about the Catholic Church, the Presbyterian Church, or Judaism, they're all in a state of flux. The institution has got to change, and it's got to be more centered towards societal issues like social justice and other sorts of things. But again, I go back, you know, to the Bible where Jesus says to, you know, Peter, upon this rock I will build my church. I think there is a place for institution. I think there is a place for organization. I think it needs to be more open and flexible. I certainly want to see the day when there are women priests in the Catholic Church and a lot of other changes. But it's people like you that have the calling to make those changes. Given your deeply spiritual, contemplative nature, you're the kind of person who can change the institution from the inside. And sure, you're going to come up against a wall of opposition and criticism, but you're strong enough to go against it. And I think you can take it on, that battle. And I encourage you to really think about how you can blend both sides, the contemplative and the institution of the church, knowing that Jesus believed it was a very important function to have a church and change it. And I really encourage you to do that.
Thank you, Nick. That's wonderful. Thank you very much for saying that. Thank you. Yeah, I sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I think it can be done. I think we have to be open-minded. I think we have to be inclusive. I think we have to be, and as long as we're not, we're going to be in trouble, right? I mean, as long as some just keep batting their head against, it's got to be this way. I think we just have to look around to know that that's not going to do it, right? We just have to look around and know that. And yeah, thank you. Thank you for saying that, Nick. Thank you. That's very encouraging. It's a little, yeah, it can be a little scary. You know, I mean, I will confess, I mean, PTS itself is a pretty conservative place. You know, and one, I'm older, and two, I say these things and you get a little bit of like playback, you know, like a little pushback. I would like to add 3 words to something. Nope, we can't do that. So, you know, those are the kind of battles, and it just is what it is. But maybe that means you just sort of have to create something new. I mean, I would like to say, let's work within what we have, because you know what, creating something new is, I don't think that's necessary. I think starting from the beginning isn't necessary. That just loses so much time and so many people along the way. I think it would be prudent to start within if we can. I do. I agree with you. Thank you for saying that, Nick.
I see Ernie, and then we'll go to Jane, and then we'll wrap up,
Yeah.
and we can stay on if others want to continue to ask some questions, but just to honor the time. Go ahead, Ernie.
Okay. Again, like Nick, I want to encourage you, Patty, to bring your contemplation into reforming the institutional church. I mean, as people with Reformed tradition, we keep talking about reform, but always being reformed by the Word of God. And we don't do that. One of clearly I spent a lot of time working in the institutional church as an elder in a congregation and as the state clerk of the presbytery. And I found that our love of decency and order frequently got in the way of doing mission. And spent much of my time as a state clerk finding workarounds, in a sense, to enable a congregation to do something, call a person as a pastor, something that ordinarily wouldn't happen within the rules. And I think we all need to be very aware that whatever institutional form we find comfortable is not the only way there is to worship God and to hear God speak to us. I think we keep coming back to finding that community, whether it's in the institutional church, whether it's on a college campus, wherever. It's in loving each other as God loved us that I think we start to understand what God's intent is for the universe.
Thank you, Ernie. Jane.
Just along the same vein, I guess, you know, so many of what I consider the really interesting writers and theologians and so forth of today. Ernie mentioned Brian McLaren and Richard Rohr. I mean, you mentioned a bunch. So many of those people are sort of outside of the institution that concerns me in terms of how do we, as Ernie said, reform the institution. And I realize it's an incredible battle because we're based on creeds and so forth. And sometimes you have to be careful if you feel like what you're going to say might be heretical or whatever. But it's just, I don't know, it's a concern that I have for the church and where the churches will be.
You know what, both that, Jane and Ernie, one of the really cool things, and I'm sort of privileged to do this right now, scholarship is changing so much.
Yeah.
We are now able to, we're re-looking at the word itself, right? And in so doing, of course, we're discovering that it was a patriarchal society, et cetera, you know, when the temple was being rebuilt, they had to save the, you know, the Jewish cult, right? I'm using that, it was a sect, right? And we're now discovering with archaeological evidence, with looking back at the actual word itself, that we've gotten a lot of it wrong in a good way, because when you start to look at the word using current interpretation, which is much more clearly accurate, and along with archaeological evidence, etc., we're discovering that the word is much more inclusive and much broader and much different than we were thinking. And that's a really good thing. You know, that is really comforting to people, because I mean, it's going to take a while to get there, right? It's going to take a while to get people to look at it differently, but I mean, I can go on and on, but it's very exciting to me that, you know, there are a lot of younger women in my classes who are still like, but the men said this and the men said that. I get that, but we can do that all day long. My sister did that for me. You know, like, good. So like, I'm looking more at opportunity about this. Like, yeah, that's true. But what if we look at it going forward? What if we can start the institution looking at the word differently for what it was really meant to say, and the inclusivity of it and the broadness of it? And we can get people to relax enough that we then get to still base everything on the word. The word just is slightly different than a lot different than we thought. And then we can still keep the institutional church built on our foundation. It's just the foundation's different than we thought, and better than we thought, more inclusive, more social justice oriented, you know? So I think there's hope there. I really do. And some of that's built on the scholarship that I'm so fond of. And at the same time, I'm going, we need to get our heads out of the books. You know, that's pretty clear. But some of the stuff the books are saying is like, yes, it's really good for us. If we can just get enough people to understand, buy in, take a breath, go along with us, you know? So I think there's a lot of hope in that, in the word on which we're built. Yeah.
Well, you know, you saying that, Patti, makes me think of Jesus, you know, interacting with the institution of, his
His
time
ministry.
with the Pharisees, and, that he would bring his understanding of scripture, which was always more inclusive and broader and deeper than kind of what, the temple,
Mhm.
how they looked
Hopefully
at
we
it.
won't have to destroy the temple,
Yeah.
Right.
but we might.
We might, but
We might.
it'll be God that'll do it. So we'll just let that be God's work. But
And I think that's where Tom's question about the fear comes in. If we can work with spirit enough not to be afraid of it, if we can just believe that it's spirit who's leading us in this direction, it's going to be okay, right? If we're clear on that versus it might be us, because if it's us, that's probably not the best way to go. But if we can just believe that spirit's been in this all along, and we're all, it sounds to me like many of us are saying similar things. And I mean, I don't mean anything by this, but Ernie, I'm going to presume that you were 25 years older than I am. That's a generation, right? So look at it, right? Look, I mean, we've got these generational, hello, I mean, I'm in class with people who are looking at me like I'm like dead, right? So like we're already crossing those lines, like, right? We're building in something that's not generational, that's not gender-based, that is bigger than that. And I think that's got lots of potential. We just can't be afraid. We just can't be afraid.
well, Gabrielle.
Well, I think, Jenny, you were onto something which has been on my mind for years, that Jesus isn't nice and we should be nice. That isn't what it's all about. And that's what somebody said, probably Brian McLaren or somebody, or maybe Cynthia Bourgeot. But anyway, I think Jesus is a complicated figure. We need to go back and see, what was he really saying? In fact, that's not very easy to figure out. Anyway, my thought is Jesus has been co-opted and packaged and is just kind of delivered to us now, and he isn't anything like that.
Right.
Well, and that's what I heard in both Ernie and Patty's stories of, as you journey through your life, maybe that packaged Jesus or packaged understanding of God in church and whatever, has been kind of torn open and is evolving and rewriting and growing and stretching and breaking sometimes, but others helping you find your way back or continue, so it's a fluid thing.
And part of that, Jenny, I think, is to reach a point that maybe we don't need a package. We need to let there be uncertainty and mystery at times, because we are finite, we are mortal, we cannot comprehend all that is going on in God's universe.
Right.
Well, and I know too that there are some who believe that, well, you have to keep it in the package because they can't handle otherwise.
Yeah.
I don't know that I really want to believe that. I don't know that I want to limit fellow human beings to, well, they're just in such a small place, they can't handle something broader than that. Why can't we? What is limiting us? If we're children of God, if we're made in God's image, why are we? I mean, we are limited and we can't understand, but why? I'm totally agreeing with you, Ernie. But we can. If we're listening to spirit, we can be led past our little pictures of things, right?
Get out of our box, at least, until
I think we're capable of that. I do. I don't believe that we're not capable of that. If you add 3 words to something in the creed, I'm not sure we can't handle that. I'm not suggesting we do it. I'm just saying I think we can handle it. I do.
Patti, you said, if we're listening to the spirit, well, that's a big if, isn't it? I mean,
Can be.
how many people are listening to the spirit just some of the time, let alone ever?
I agree.
I mean, if you have an answer for that, that's fine. That's my reaction to that.
Well, I think Patty pointed toward part of that through the series of spiritual practices and so on that she has found useful in opening her ears, as it were, to hear the Spirit. And personally, I don't pay enough attention to that. I should be doing more of that. Because we fill our minds with our own problems and are not willing to hear the Spirit say, really, you need to be looking over there, not there.
Yeah.
Well, and just this whole conversation of hearing your stories, sharing it, us now engaging in these this great conversation, the Spirit is moving, because as God has moved in our lives and we put it out there for others to hear, you have no idea what God wants to touch somebody else's life because of what you're sharing about what God did for you. So this is beautiful to me. Because I think that's, to me, one of the blind spots of a lot of us in church, that my faith is very personal, private, I just, it's between me and God, we're good. But Jesus calls us to be a community and his body, and we don't have it all, and there's something that you share that God's doing in your life, or you might not even see it that way, but it'll hit me that, oh my gosh, that was amazing. Or, that's kind of touching something in my life that now I can maybe say, I think that might be God stirring in me. So this is, to me, part of the Spirit moving as we share our stories, as we talk about it. You look at, the study we did that led up to this, Simon Peter, you look at what God did in his life, encountering him through Jesus, this, fisherman, and all the things that he was invited into, and and then he fails, and Jesus is crucified, and like did we follow this guy for nothing, but then he preaches this amazing sermon when the Spirit comes upon him at Pentecost, and the church takes off. And so I don't know, it's just, to me, a mystery, and but I think this is rich, for us to be sharing our stories, and everybody's story is unique. We all have different experiences, and but sharing the journey with each other and encouraging each other. And sometimes one of us not sure we believe anymore, and that's okay, but we continue to walk with each other. And I remember years ago somebody saying, sometimes when I can't carry the faith because I'm just so grief stricken, or I'm so, I'm still part of this community, so you carry the faith for me, until I'm able to come back to it, and still love me and still be here. And so, I don't know, I'm babbling, but anyway, I think the Spirit's moving just in what we are doing today. And thank you both for being so vulnerable with us and willing to share your stories. It is 11:45, so we're 15 minutes beyond the hour. So I do want to.
Are you being me, Jenny? Have you taken us too long because you're being me? That's my
I'm trying to listen to the Spirit, which is lovely. It's been rich. So I do want to close with prayer, but we can hang on a little bit if anybody wants to continue the conversation. So let me do that. And I want to thank both Ernie and Patti for doing this. And if any of you out there down the road would be interested someday to share your story, and it isn't going to be their story, so don't go like, oh, I could never say what they said. Well, no, because it's not your story. So thinking about what's your story. So with that, let me close. Gracious Lord, we give you praise and thanks for the ways that you speak to us. And one of the ways is through the stories that we share with each other. Thank you so much for Ernie and for Patti and for the sharing of the stories that you're writing in their lives with us, and help us as we go our ways today to listen more openly to the story that you're writing in our lives, and what about that can we share with another, and who knows what you might do with that when we share it with another. Bless us all, carry us forward as your people, as people of hope, and give us eyes to see your resurrected, risen presence among us in the days to come. We ask in Jesus' name, amen. Well, Ernie and Patti, are you able to stay on a little longer if people want to ask more questions or engage?
Sure.
Craig?
I have no question, but I do want to say that it was a wonderful experience, kind of between a lot of thought, and I do appreciate not only your sharing, but the vulnerability that you had with really letting us see where your decision making was made, and why, and how God helped you through really, really hard times, and when there were gaps of time where you were not involved specifically with the organized church. So I just want to say thank you.
And Craig, I see your hand up.
Again, I'd like to thank them both for sharing their stories. But to go back to Nick and Ernie, I'm also a small town hick who went to Ivy League on scholarship. So, and the struggles were very difficult, but I think that struggle had begun earlier and continues to this day. And the reason I'm here is because I'm still struggling. And
Welcome, brother. We're there together.
And Ernie, I got a personal question for you since you've been in the hierarchy of the Presbyterian Church so long. Did you ever get to meet the executive presbyter from Newton by the name of Chestnut?
I've met him. He had moved on, I think, just before I got involved at the presbytery level.
In the late 90s, he moved on.
Yeah.
But in my storyline, I grew up with him. He was in my church. He moved on to executive presbyter.
Yep.
Came back and helped me get married in a Catholic church. And he recently passed away. And when I went to his funeral, there was a pastor called the Reverend David Young who gave his eulogy, which brings me back to the very first time I went to Westminster. I went to an annual Sunday school class, sat down. There was one other empty chair. 3 minutes later, Bob Young comes in and sits next to me.
Okay.
So my connection to the old church, to this church,
Right.
is just part of my journey. But
yeah, it's and God's working in both our cases, you with Bob Young and David Young, and maybe meeting Don in a very different context just before he came to Westminster.
Yes.
God was doing some pre-planning, whether we do it or not.
Sure.
Judy.
And this is a thank you to, but I have been struck throughout this by this reminder of how big God is and how God speaks to every one of us in different ways. And to listen to two stories that have similarities, but vast differences too. And there are pieces that I can say, oh yeah, that's what I grew up with. Other pieces that I can say, oh yeah, I remember that. And to be reminded that those experiences are genuine. And to remember that in conversations with others, we can share our story, but we need to recognize that when we listen to their story, that it's genuine too. And I think that's the word that kept coming back up to me was genuine. And thank you.
Joni. Oh, you're mute. You have to unmute.
I was just wondering, Patty, how important did you feel a personal spiritual director has been in your journey?
I would tell every human being they need a spiritual director. Yeah, I cannot possibly say enough about the practice. I'm currently in process of becoming one. I can't say enough about the process and about, I eventually did the Ignatian exercises because of her, which has been very important as well. I can't say enough. I think Ellie and I have been together now for 13 years. I'm going on 13 years, pretty much once a month. There was a blip when I was working in the school district and couldn't get there, but yeah, I would say it makes a tremendous difference. The insight, the calming insight and the discernment and the knowledge that it's spirit working is so evident in that process, I think. I also don't know anybody who's been in the process who doesn't believe that. Having said that, if you're not open to it, if you're not quite, receptive to it, probably not so much, but.
How did you research who you were going to select as a spiritual director?
I actually had a very good friend at Wayne who knew somebody. Oops, did she go? Oh, we still have Jen? Did she leave? Oh no, she's who knew me well enough and said, I think this person would be right for you. And it turned out that was the case. I will tell you though, that I have heard, and I will tell you the horror stories just because we're talking about spiritual direction here. I know one woman who went through 4 directors who it just wasn't a match. Luckily, she stayed with the process and found one that she adores. Because everybody does it a little differently, I was just lucky. The person knew me well enough, knew Ellie well enough, and hooked us up, and it was correct. It was right. It was right on. But there is a SDI, Spiritual Directors International, that you can go on and look for people in your area, that you can interview people if you want to. There's a huge resource.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. But I would, Joni, if you're thinking about it, you should do it. If you're being bugged about this and nudged, that's spirit saying go do it. That's all I can tell you. You're on your own from there, but that's what they're doing. That's what spirit's doing.
I'm looking behind me to see if the board is there. Well, I can tell you, just being in this journey class has meant so much to me, because I feel there's a willingness to be open and be vulnerable, that just means a lot to me. Thank you. Thank you for both of your stories today.
You're welcome. And I just like piggyback on that and point ahead to our discussion over the next several weeks about racism, because I think some of the spirit we've felt today, we need to carry over into that discussion.
Absolutely.
Because ultimately, in the racism issue, it starts in here.
Yes.
With each of us. And I think if we can be willing in those classes to let ourselves be a bit vulnerable about our encounters, our practices of racism, if you will, it may help us move towards some things we can do together.
Yeah, thank you for saying
I appreciate that.
Yeah, just a heads up. I will, Chris is leading it this coming Sunday. I'm going to go to New Orleans. Our grandson, who was born in October, is going to be baptized next Sunday. So we're going to be down there. So I will miss, but you will be in good hands with him leading it.
Great.
Jane, I see your hand up. Jane.
Oh, Yeah, this is a question actually for Ernie. When you started out, you're talking about a hymn. You quoted a hymn, and
Right.
if I understood it, that there was this line about you were seeking God, but then God was seeking you. Something to that effect.
Yeah, that I had to recognize that God has already been seeking me. Basically, is the thrust of the hymn. And then, it was not I that found, O Savior, true. No, I was found of thee. I mean, it's good Victorian English, but I think the point there, which I think is one that John was making in the sermon today, is that it is Jesus who is reaching out, who went to show the doubting disciples, all of them, not just Thomas, that God is actively the seeker in our lives.
And I love that concept, and I apply it to myself, I guess, in terms of seeing it as a gift.
Yeah.
But I think we talked about this a couple weeks ago, but it still is, it's a puzzle to me. Because it kind of gets to that idea of being the chosen, which I struggle with.
Well,
Why is the gift? Why do I see the gift given to me and maybe not to my neighbor, or why they don't see it? Not that it's not given.
I mean, I have to. I keep coming back to, God is seeking everyone. God would be overjoyed if everyone responded, but we all too often sort of ignore God speaking to us. So I don't see the chosen as being so much privileged, but that somehow God prepared my heart to hear God speaking.
It's chosen to be used by God.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily believe in that concept. I guess I struggle with how do you convey that to somebody who doesn't respond or doesn't see that, and yet if we believe God is open and choosing everyone and searching for everyone, how do you kind of convey that to somebody? Could you just say, well, God's searching for you? How would they know that?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, maybe I'm getting way off track here, but
I think you sometimes can't know it until you're on the other side of it and can look back and realize all along God's been there and I couldn't see it. Or I think the love, for me, it all comes back to love. You are loved. We are loved, whether or not we recognize it, whether or not we can see it, and that's what I can share with someone who maybe doesn't see that I can say it, you are loved, you are precious, you are important, you are, and whether you feel it, I have no control over that, but I can say it to you, that you matter.
That's right, Jenny. We can't.
Yeah, Nick.
I just wanted to follow up what Jane was talking about. There's a wonderful poem, Jane, called The Hound of Heaven. Someone called Francis Thompson. And he was English and he was a Catholic. But he uses Jesus as a metaphor with the hound of heaven. And basically says, no matter how much you try to hide from Jesus, no matter what dark streets you decide to walk down, no matter what terrible situations you might get in, Jesus is always there looking for you to bring you home. And the whole idea is that Jesus is an active savior He'll come into your life at the right moments to bring you back. And I encourage you to read the poem. It's never
Okay.
left me from the first time I read it, that idea that you can try to hide, but you can't.
Yep.
Jesus and God will find you and they will bring you home. It is a wonderful poem. It's very meaningful. And I think you'll get a lot out of it if you take the time to read it.
I've often referenced that poem in my own life, you know, that he has never let me go. He's always pursued me, even though I walked down a lot of different paths. He's always been there. And he's always made himself aware. I was thinking about some of the things that you said, Patty, you know, in different events in my life. And the Hounds of Heaven is a great example of pursuit.
It is 1 o'clock and I need to get off. I don't know if I get off.
You will end the entire thing.
Oh, I end the whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to push it over to host, and I'll be the host, and then I can end it?
Yeah, I'll do
If
that.
everybody still if people still want to stay on. If you just push host
Yeah,
over, then
let me
somebody else
do
can end it.
that. I'll put you over, Patty.
Yeah.
That
should be okay. If you leave yourself,
I'm gonna make. Whoops, I had it and then I just lost it. Let me get. I'll make you the host.
yeah. If we say co-host, you leave and it leaves.
Yeah.
So you need to.
So you
Have a good trip.
Yeah, you want to stop recording?
That should do. Oh yeah, you can just stop recording.
Okay, and you are now the host.
Okay.
Yes, it says it on my screen.
And that means I can stop recording.
Oh, it says I have to ask the host to give you permission to record, so you have to stop the recording.
Okay, I got it. I'll stop.
Okay.